This is my data collection methods presentation for assignment 4.3. So let's start off with looking at the different types of research designs. The research design helps define the type of study that is happening. It refers to the structure or the plan of a piece of research, and having a clear research design helps a researcher to gain more reliable results. The first research design is an investigation. An investigation is an observation which is done under either controlled conditions, for example when done in a lab, or uncontrolled conditions, such as a more natural setting like a field experiment. In this design, the researcher is more active due to being the investigator within their own study. To have an investigation, a hypothesis is needed so you can have a prediction of what you believe will happen. The independent variable is manipulated and extraneous variables are controlled. At the end, you can then compare your findings with the initial hypothesis to see if your predictions were correct. An example of an investigation could be seeing whether more hours spent training has a positive or negative effect on performance levels for different age gymnasts. The next design is correlational, which is where you're looking for a relationship between two conditions, variables, or studies. Correlation can be either positive or negative. Positive correlation is when an increase in one variable causes an increase in another, and negative is when an increase in one variable causes a decrease in the other. An example of a correlational study would be looking at if there is a relationship between height and weight for a professional gymnast. Next is cross-sectional, which is when information is recorded without manipulating the environment, and this normally includes a range of participants, such as different age, gender, and nationalities. The data is collected all at the same time, and we can look at this design as a kind of snapshot, as everything is included in one shot or at one time. For example, studying 4 groups of gymnasts that are aged 7 to 11, 12 to 16, 17 to 21, and 21 plus, and seeing what their scores would be in a gymnastics routine. The next type is longitudinal studies, which are kind of the opposite to cross-sectional studies, as these are done over a long period of time, which can be over months, years, or even decades. It usually involves looking at the same participants and looking to see a certain change in an area over time. For example, looking at how young participants improve at a certain skill between the age of 10 and 20. Another type of design that can be used is a case study. Now this is an in-depth analysis of one person or group or place, which is done over many years. The data that is collected is usually gathered using different methods, such as observations and interviews. An example scenario could be looking at how a gymnast trains and manages themselves leading up to a competition. The final design is a comparative study, which is when you look for any similarities or differences in 2 or more pieces of research. The aim is to draw conclusions about the research that is done, and the comparisons are usually cross-national, or comparing 2 separate groups of people. For example, comparing the height and weight of GB gymnasts and USA gymnasts. The next section of this presentation is looking at the 2 types of data that can be found. The first is primary data, which is data that is observed or collected from first-hand experience, meaning that you have carried out the study and gathered the findings yourself. Some advantages of this type of data are that it is higher in reliability because of the fact that you've carried out the study yourself, and also the fact that you determine the data is collected, meaning that you don't get any unwanted data because you have the ability to choose what data you collect at the end of it. However, some disadvantages of primary data are the fact that because you have to do the study yourself, it can be very time-consuming and expensive, and also that you are responsible for organising everything from participants to equipment used. The other type of data is secondary. This is data that is collected by someone else because the procedures and findings are not your own. This data can be used for comparisons if you have done your own research as well. Advantages of secondary data are that due to others having done the study for you, it is a much quicker process. Another advantage is that, as I mentioned, secondary data can be used to compare with your own research or other research that's been done, which can then allow you to see how reliable the results are of different studies about the same topic, and if there were any similarities or differences. On the other hand, disadvantages of that are that there is possibly lower reliability in the results that you take due to others having done the research, and so you don't know how well they manage to control the extraneous variables. And another disadvantage is that you may get unwanted data because it's unlikely that somebody else would have done the exact same study as you and got the findings that you were after in the first place. So there are 4 levels of data that we will look at. The first of these is discrete data, which is data that can be put into categories. Discrete data is usually counted in full or whole numbers, and when put into categories, it is usually one or the other. For example, gender, you're either male or female, or smoking status, you either smoke or you don't. The next level of data is ordinal. This is data that is ordered or put into relative rankings. The numbers don't have to be equidistant, and 0 is irrelevant because the rankings usually start at 1. An example of ordinal data is finished places in a competition, because these are ranked from first place down to second and then third, etc., etc. The third level is nominal, and this is data that is again put into name categories, and this is usually the least informative level of data. An example of nominal data could be the different types of gymnastics events, such as high bars, floor, vault, and parallel bars. And participants would then be asked to put themselves into the group based on the event that they feel most comfortable in, that they feel they're best at. And this would then give different groups of different participants, and the researcher would be able to see how many would be in each group. So the final level is continuous, which is split into 2 types, either ratio or interval. Ratio is ranked order with equal intervals, and 0 is irrelevant. So for example, height or weight. And interval is again ranked orderings with equal intervals. However, the difference between ratio and interval data is the fact that interval it can include negative numbers. So I put there, for example, temperature, because temperature can go below 0. So the next section of this assignment is about qualitative data and methods of collecting it. So the first is observations, and this is when you observe and record people's behaviours without deliberate manipulation of variables. So observations can either be covert or overt. Covert observations are when you do them without the participants knowing, so they don't know that they're being part of a study. Whereas overt observations are when the participants know they're being observed and they know that their behaviours are being watched. So advantages of covert observations include the ability to identify behaviours that wouldn't be present in an interview or questionnaire. So because if a questionnaire is done privately, you're unable to see the body language or the time it takes them to answer the questions, whereas in an observation, you can see their natural body language and how they would approach certain situations. And as we said, you tend to see more natural behaviour due to participants being in natural settings. However, disadvantages include the possibility of misreading body language, and therefore there's a chance that you could make incorrect conclusions about what that body language would then mean. And another disadvantage is the fact that observations can be quite costly and sometimes time consuming. So advantages of over observations include the fact that notes can be more detailed because you're seeing their participants display more natural behaviours, and so you can make more observations about what you see, and also the fact that the data is immediate because you're making the notes as you see the behaviours, so you're not having to wait for them to finish their day or whatever it is, you're making it as you see it. However, disadvantages include the participants possibly showing demand characteristics, which is where participants change their behaviour because they think that they know what the researcher is looking for. And another disadvantage is, which is similar to demand characteristics, which is the risk of the Hawthorne effect, which is basically where the participants change their behaviours because they know that they're part of the study, they know they're being observed. So the next method of collecting qualitative data is interviews, and there are four main types of interviews. These are structured, unstructured, semi-structured, and focus groups. Structured interviews are when the researcher has a set of questions that don't change, regardless of the responses that the participant gives. Unstructured interviews are when you have a starter question to start off with, but then the whole rest of the interview is completely improvised and can change depending on the responses that you get from the participant. Semi-structured interviews are where you have a few kind of set questions that you want to ask, but you also have the ability to kind of branch off and change those questions depending on the answers that you get. And then finally, focus groups are like kind of group interviews, which they tend to have a more semi-structured form, but instead of just interviewing one person, you have a whole group of people. Advantages of structured interviews are that the data is in their own words of the participants, and so you get their own kind of personal opinions and views. Also, you can judge and assess their body language and the tone and their expression when they give their answers, which again would be hidden in something like a questionnaire because you're not hearing them speak, you just get what they wrote down on a piece of paper. However, disadvantages are that there's no real depth within the answers that you get, as you're only asking the set questions that you thought of before. And also you can't query the answers and ask why they've said something because of that set structure that you have. So advantages of unstructured interviews are that you're able to gather a much wider range of information due to there not being a set structure of questions that you have to ask. And you're also able to kind of build up rapport within the interview due to it being more of a conversation and less kind of formal. On the other hand, disadvantages are that there is a chance you could go off topic due to not having questions written down that you have to ask. There is a chance that you could rapidly go off topic and then not get the data that you want. And also, unstructured interviews can take more time depending on the responses that you get, because as a researcher you have to be very patient and not rush the participants and let them kind of voice their whole opinion. Semi-structured interviews, some advantages are that you can get wanting information as well as additional information due to the ability that you have of querying the answers that the participants give. And also you're able to ask about kind of more sensitive subjects due to having no fixed structure. So if there's an answer you think, oh, why have they said that? You're able to query and ask why, and then get the more information that you want. However, some of the disadvantages are that you could go off topic again, like unstructured, and that semi-structured can be more cost and time